Sunday School Leader. Welcome to my office. I'm trying to be very hospitable to you today, and that's what our lesson is about this week, isn't it? Remember, we're in the unit that's entitled Welcome Home, Connecting and Engaging People in Our Church. We're in the third week. It's called Gracious Hospitality out of 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. And the point of the lesson is ground your service and love in hospitality. Now, the Old Testament book of Proverbs has a lot of pithy sayings, doesn't it? Those are those little nuggets of truth, and one comes right after another. And sometimes there doesn't seem to be any connection from one verse to the other. I was reading, and I think it was Proverbs 13, and one verse talked about how one takes advice, and the next verse talked about dishonesty, and the next verse talked about hope. It was just all these little sayings that were true. They just didn't seem to have any connection. And upon reading this passage out of 1 Peter chapter 4, and by the way, there's only 5 verses in our lesson text this week, but there's a lot of good stuff in those 5 verses. Anyway, you might think that as well, that these might just be little individual sayings that really aren't connected. We've talked about the end of time, then they talk about love and hospitality, and then service and speaking and serving. And hopefully, I think you'll see by the end of our study that these are all connected, okay? First of all, it's good to know, why did Peter write this letter, and to whom was he writing? Well, in chapter 1, verse 1, we see that this is addressed to Christians, mainly Gentile believers, and this is in the area, the people he was writing to were living in the area of what we know as, today, it's modern-day Turkey. And these Christians were suffering persecution and in their various regions. Peter encouraged these readers to endure their present suffering and their persecution by giving themselves entirely to God. They were to remain faithful in the times of distress. And it's really good to know this background instead of just picking out those 5 verses and trying to make a Sunday school lesson out of it. You got to know the background. Why is Peter writing this letter? So let's look at most of these verses individually, and hopefully we'll see how they all fit together. Verse 7 talks about the end of all things is near. Now, Peter's probably not expecting the Lord's return in the next week or so, even though they were living expectantly like that, but probably more as an encouragement to those whom he was writing to, those suffering persecution. Just like, it's almost like he was echoing Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, where Paul says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." In other words, in that timeline of eternity, right, our troubles are just a little blip on that timeline. We have an eternity of heaven with God to look forward to, so hang in there. Keep pressing on. Don't kick back and just look to heaven and wait on Jesus. No, in the meantime, Christians have jobs to do, don't we? We're to be alert, we're to be self-controlled, to be sober-minded. And why is that? Right there in verse 7, why does he want us to do that? So we can pray. Now, could Peter have had a little flashback here as he was writing this, or maybe this helped prompt him to write this, to think about that night before Jesus' crucifixion? Jesus and the disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus asked the disciples to come and pray with him. What do the disciples do? Man, they're so tired they just fall asleep, which I think most of us have done that in our prayer times at one time or another. They couldn't stay awake. And so as Peter's talking about staying alert and sober-minded to pray, I'm wondering if that actually came back to his mind. But why is Peter encouraging them to pray and not do more of a tangible action like witness or whatever? Well, keep that communication open with God. Because when you do that, you're better able to discern what to do when the Holy Spirit's allowed to take control of our lives. And prayer should be the foundation of everything that the Christian does. We look in verse 8, he encourages them to love each other deeply. You probably know this, but that love word is that verb form of the noun agape, which is that God-like, forgiving love, that self-sacrificing love. And it says it covers a multitude of sins. Now we can certainly pluck that verse out of context and make it say what it doesn't say. But This is not an excuse for an offender. This is not, well, if you loved me, you'd overlook this. No, it's not that at all. This is very similar to Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12, that says, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. Because when there is agape love in a relationship, offenses are frequently overlooked and quickly forgotten. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15? Love keeps no record of wrongs. Okay, so this all ties together. That's what it means when love covers a multitude of sins. It's not that it glosses over it, but if we have that true agape love, those things that offend us, those things that irritate us, we're going to tend to overlook those a little bit more, aren't we? We get down to verse 9. It talks about showing hospitality without grumbling. Also, it's a reflection here of what Paul says in Romans 12:13 when he says, share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. Also, the writer of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, the writer encourages the readers of that letter to show hospitality to strangers. Remember, in that day, staying in inns could be dangerous. And on top of that, believers were suffering persecution, so it's kind of a double whammy for those believers who were traveling. And so Peter's encouraging the believers to show hospitality, especially to other believers. Show that agape love. What does Jesus say? Jesus himself in John 13:35. By this you will know that you are my disciples if what? If you love one another. Now, people can be hospitable, or at least pretend to be hospitable, but complain about it, can't they? They tend to put the spit in hospitality. Because why? Well, okay, I've got to vacuum, I've got to cook, I've got to clean, I've got to straighten up. And then there's the Johnson's kid. You know, every time he comes over here, he tears up stuff and he spills water on the floor, and then he goes and he opens up all of our drawers and scatters everything around. And I wish they'd leave that little brat at home. See, hospitality is not necessarily easy. Living the Christian life is not necessarily easy, but it's commanded. All right, so show hospitality, show it without grumbling. In verse 10, Peter separates spiritual gifts into two main categories, speaking and serving. And both of these are used to minister to other people, not to self. Unlike most gifts, you know, when we give a birthday gift or a Christmas gift, the gift is given to the recipient for the recipient. But a spiritual gift is given to the believer actually for the use, or for the benefit, I should say, for the benefit of other people. So as we look at all these verses, what's the connection in these verses that they seem like they could just stand alone, and they can, but there's a connection between all these. What is that? I tend to think it's relationships. We start off with God in verse 7 at the beginning, and it talks about prayer. And then at the end of our text in verse 11, it talks about doing all these things so that God can be praised. So you've got the relationship with God there. And then all throughout the rest of the verses, the relationships with other people, specifically other Christians. Not exclusively, but specifically here, other Christians. There's those so many one another's in these verses. There's the love each other, the offer hospitality to one another, to serve others. So there's that relationship there with the Christian and other people. This is what keeps Christians strong, especially during trials and persecutions. The relationship with God, the relationship with other people. So here's some questions to ask your class. How are you doing in these two areas? How's your relationship with God? How are your relationships with other people? You know, we tend to be a little more isolated than we used to. You know, back in the day, back in the 50s, maybe even in the 60s and 70s, before air conditioning was as common as it is now, people would sit on their front porch, talk to their neighbors. Now our cars are air conditioned, our houses are air conditioned. We get into our cars at work, drive with the windows up. We're isolated from the world. We drive, we hit the remote control, the garage door opens, we go in, close it. We're in our house for the rest of the evening. Not out on the front porch talking to the neighbors. Yeah. And so there's that isolation mentality that we have. So how's our relationship with other people? How's our relationship with God? You see, I found that those who weather the storms or the trials of life the best are those Christians who have both a strong prayer life and who have that strong support group of other Christians. That's why, to me, it's so important that people are involved in small groups and Sunday school classes where people will earnestly know you, love you, pray for you, and all that. So how can your class be more hospitable? How can your church be more hospitable? Last week we had a first-time guest in our church, and one of our Sunday school teachers found him, encouraged him to come and sit with him and his family, took him to Sunday school, and then invited him to lunch afterwards. Now, that's hospitality. Now, you don't have to do that all the time, but that is showing people that they matter, you care for them, and you want to get to know them better. Remember in verse 4, our lesson started off talking about prayer. One of the most hospitable things you can do is to pray for your class members. That's one of the best things you can do for them. So don't forget to do that this week, all right? Next week, we're going to be in Luke chapter 10, looking at being intentional in our love toward one another. Have a great Sunday school lesson.